At some point, you have to start looking elsewhere, whether it's purchase services or capital equipment. And that's where the real money is. If you think about, there's 350 plus projects north of $100 million going on in the country. And that's just like, I'm sure there's a lot more than that I'm aware of. And there's millions and millions of dollars that are being spent on equipment. And somebody needs to make sure they're buying the right stuff at the end of the day. I mean, it's real money.
Without supplies, there's no surgery. Without products, there's no patient care. Welcome to Power Supply, the healthcare supply chain podcast focused on helping you navigate the intricacies of logistics, purchasing, contracting, and supplier relationships. Each episode, we speak with healthcare executives, supply chain leaders, and innovative entrepreneurs from across the country as they share their stories, experience, and expertise on the industry we love. From the loading dock to strategic sourcing, from buyers to the C-suite, and across the enterprise, we tackle the real-life issues impacting the healthcare supply chain. Whether you're tuning in for conversation or inspiration, we're glad you're here. You're just in time to hear it from the source and stock up on insight. So sit back and plug into Power Supply.
On this episode of Power Supply, we speak with Tom Redding, Senior Managing Director of Healthcare at St. Onge Company, and we're going to be talking about SPD, renovations, the impact on supply chain logistics, and considerations, because I do feel like supply chain's role in these renovations and new builds continues to expand. Big trend in the industry, focusing on indirect spend. You see it from a lot of the consulting groups. You see it from GPOs. Everybody really starting to focus on this, and I think it's pulling supply chain more and more into the puzzle. So Tom's going to tell us, how early should you get involved and what are some best practices, Gary?
Justin, looking forward to hearing him. I think you can make some giant mistakes if you do not look at the planning stage and include supply chain. There's so much downstream effect. I'm looking forward to see what SPD expertise he can bring to the show today, and just excited about having him on and getting us dialed up for success within the hospital and our patients and our ultimately supporting our mission. So looking forward to the conversation today.
All right. Don't go anywhere. Tom is up next. We'll be right back.
I'm Hayes Walder.
This is Gary Skinner.
And I'm Justin Poulin.
From the studios of Healthcare HQ, you're listening to Power Supply.
Tom Redding, Senior Managing Director, Healthcare at St. Onge Company, joining us now. And we've had a few conversations in the past about construction and sourcing, but we're going to get even more granular, because one of the trends that we're seeing in the industry today is renovations and new builds, quite honestly, for sterile processing departments, but it's got a big implication for logistics. And I can tell you, our sister brand, Beyond Clean, that podcast is actually the flagship under the Healthcare HQ Media umbrella. And when we first got started, I can't tell you how many SPD managers that I talked to that are like, oh, I was going to get this awesome brand new department, and we had these great designs, and the next thing I know, I've got, 60% of the actual square footage that I thought I was going to have. And, it's all of those considerations. And Tom is here to talk to us in intricate detail about SPD. So Tom, thanks so much for coming on the show. I really appreciate having you today.
Yeah, thanks for having me, guys.
We're excited here. And I have to ask first, you went to Kettering University, is that correct?
That is true. Yeah, in Flint, Michigan. And I actually made it out, which is a good thing.
That's better than Gary could say.
I think it's ranked like the worst, from a per capita crime in the country. It's pretty wild.
No kidding. Well, I think the mascot's a bulldog or something, as I remember, right?
Yeah, it is. Exactly.
Well, y'all need it up there, sounds like. All right.
Hey, that's impressive.
Yeah,
hold on a second. I have to pause. Do you know every mascot for every college across the country?
No, I don't know every mascot, but I do know some.
That's his Jeopardy That's his double Jeopardy column that he gets and none of the rest. That's it right there.
I think it's a big gray bulldog, as I remember.
Well, it changed colors all the time, so I never really knew what color it was. They used to always spray paint the dog on the campus, so it was always different colors depending on the season or whatever was going on. So
crazy.
Frankly, I'm not even sure what the color is.
All right, well, that doesn't matter. I thought it was just trying to get a little levity going here.
Yeah.
Because you're going to have a question from Gary here in a little bit, and that'll just kind of drain the whole thing.
Oh my goodness.
Right out of the gate. We don't even know Tom's experience yet. And you're already
let's get into it. Let's focus on Tom and give
he's
us
got a baseball background. I'm starting to feel anxious already. Like, oh my goodness.
I know. I'm kind of nervous. We were complimenting him about his weight loss, and now he's got a bat.
It's the fungo. It's for hitting infield. Let's go. Game on.
Oh, jeez.
Yeah, that's Gary's background. Big baseball guy.
Did you see the tiger on his desk earlier? There was a tiger in the back. And maybe it was a jaguar. Maybe I don't know. It was a big
puma.
Cat. Puma. There you go.
He's out in Idaho. All right, Tom. So let's get into your background. You didn't start in healthcare. So why don't you tell us about what you were doing before you got into healthcare, and then how did you find yourself supporting hospitals all around the country?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, Hayes brought up about Kettering. I had these big dreams in my, early, in undergrad that I was going to design cars and do all these things. And that's why I went to Kettering to begin with, because they're primarily automotive engineering. And then I realized pretty quickly that all you're going to be designing is seat buckles and, and the mirrors and all those types of things. So I would say through that work and through my co-op, I did a lot of work around manufacturing and more process improvement and, manufacturing and ultimately in distribution, kind of working for UPS for a period of time. Honestly, when I got to a certain point, it was kind of like day in and day out. It was kind of like the same thing going on and on. It was all about process improvement. Those are things I was doing, but it was kind of like you kind of knew what you were going to be doing tomorrow. You knew what you were going to do the next day. And I really wanted something variety. So at the time, my neighbor introduced me to St. Ange, and I had applied and, got the job. I've been here almost 17 years now. And I kind of just fell into healthcare, quite honestly. And it was the healthcare team was just getting started. And I think for me over the last 17 years, I think it's been tremendous to see just how much healthcare has changed, healthcare supply chain, SPD, all those different operations, how they're starting to grow up. And I still say that, healthcare supply chain is a bit of a laggard. I mean, it's decades behind other industries. And everything that we're doing within St. Ange, we're doing a lot of work outside of healthcare. And how do we leverage those capabilities and all those different things that are going on outside to kind of bring it into healthcare, continue to kind of raise the waterline about what's going on, throughout the industry.
One of the things, and it's kind of off topic a little bit, but it does tie into SPD. In a lot of ways, I feel like we're throwing a lot of technology at healthcare, but we're not necessarily utilizing the technology. Is that a common kind of pattern for what you see? It's like these other industries have technology, but they also have maybe a foundation that's a little more solid in terms of like even just understanding parts and SKUs and end-to-end supply chain versus just what's kind of like right there being delivered to the dock every day.
Yeah, I think one of the fundamental differences between healthcare and call it non-healthcare is it's about data and it's about the accuracy and completeness of the data that they're leveraging. I think unfortunately too many times where, somebody tries to put in some sort of system or technology and you find out pretty quickly that the underlying data that feeds and manages, it's part of that system is broken and it's kind of like garbage in, garbage out. So I will say there's more of a foundational effort in many other industries where healthcare, I think you talk about UDI, you talk about all the different kind of data standards that have been going on, but that's just a starting point for health systems. I think it's easy to buy technology. And I think one of the things that we're finding is how do you incorporate that into some of the workflows? Unfortunately, there's almost workarounds that have to be created just from the systems and technology people that are buying because they think it's going to solve all their problems. I had a CEO one time saying, I just want to buy a new point of use inventory management system. And I told him, listen, you're just going to waste your time. You're going to waste your money because at the end of the day, the item master that you have is quite frankly garbage. The information that's going to be captured is garbage. And until you do that and you manage the underlying structure of it, you're blowing money into the wind. And I think that's an area where health systems are starting to understand that like you have to invest in what I'll call the basics. And until they do that well, again, they're going to be, way behind, spend a lot of money on technology, just doesn't get the benefit.
Hey, Tom, you brought up a really good point. You find these gaps and you just everyone wants to just throw the bridge across it and fix it right now, but you're really taking 4 steps backwards to really kind of figure out what it truly looks like. Who are the right people to get on board, within the hospital system? You need some executive sponsors. Do you need a full team? Do you need a value analysis? Where do you start to really get them to understand we've got to pause, like the Item Master deal? You brought it up. I've been down that road. It's tough. What's your experience and who do you go to kind of get that moving in the right direction?
Yeah. Honestly, it all starts with the CFO to get them to understand, and this is where maybe potentially doing an assessment for somebody to understand kind of what's working, what's not working. We do a lot of those in SPD as well. It's just, there's a point where it's where are things, broken, and how do you start to say, how do you prioritize? Where do you make those investments? Do you hire people? Do you realign structurally? Do you have the right systems in place? Do you have the right metrics in place? It kind of starts there. I think the secondary piece, which comes up many, many times on projects, is the chief nursing officer. If they're not bought into any of these individual solutions, or if, they're making changes potentially to how you're doing block scheduling, to how you're managing trays, or how you're managing supplies in the OR, those things can quickly take you sideways and realize that you're not going to get the value out of it. And I think that's where, again, I think the CFO and quite honestly, the CNO are the two big factors. The COO is involved in those things, but those two are the main drivers for sure.
You mentioned workflows and technology, and just as we kind of drill down into sterile processing, I'd say traditionally it's a department that's been starved for technology, but their workflows can get pretty broken too, especially and I'd say this is improving, but it used to be just constant chaos, right? We've got add-ons, we've got, emergency cases that are coming in for trauma, and it's hard to plan. Especially if you're a level 1 trauma center, really hard for sterile processing to kind of plan work and workflows. But now we're talking about doing renovations. And I know, looking at how that impacts workflows is going to be a part of this discussion. But why do you think so much emphasis on SPD today?
Well, I think if you look back at the pandemic and, just as simple as the amount of surgeries that were canceled and the immediate financial impact that it had on the organization. Again, there's a reminder of the fact that the surgery, the surgery platform and all the different things that are supporting that are extremely critical to, again, profitability of health systems. And I think the other piece of it is, I think there's a lot of changes that are happening within SPD, meaning, it could be what I would call IFUs. So again, there's a more stringent need to, from a washing and cleansing and sterilization of those individual trays and instruments, everything that go with it. I think there's a lot more heightened sensitivity around quality than it's ever been. I think you talk about any kind of infections. Again, it starts with SPD, and you might say, well, a surgeon touches one patient, but SPD touches thousands and thousands of patients, and the things that they do or things that they don't do can have a direct impact on patient care or the surgery outcomes. And you might say, well, the physician has gloves and everything else, but you have people in SPD that are touching things and that are making sure everything that they're doing is correct and it's done well. If not, then again, the surgeon can do everything correctly. The circulators can do everything correctly, but the underlying things that they're using, if they're not sterilized or there's potential debris or other things that might cause infection, that's significant. And health systems don't have the ability to kind of absorb those challenges on a daily basis. They can't.
We just had a recent conversation about instructions for use. And, if you're on a sterile processing podcast, you hear IFU or instructions for use constantly. It might not be as common necessarily for supply chain to hear about that, but it's literally the guide for how you're going to clean a reusable instrument. And if you have to disassemble it, and there's a lot that goes into that. And we actually had a conversation recently, around some of the challenges even in standardizing that and making that information accessible, and are health systems getting the updates when they're made, because there may have been something that had to be addressed by the manufacturer once the device is actually out there on the market. How does that fit into renovations and workflow? Like, I know where you're kind of going here, but tie that into like the criteria and the vision around a reno or a total new build for SPD.
Yeah. So if you think about, and maybe for lack of better words, a cycle time it takes to wash or process a tray. And if you start to say, well, you need to spend more time doing that and do it more thoroughly, that means that you're going to need more sinks. You're going to need more ultrasonic cleaners. You're going to need to have more potential washers. There's going to need to have, the list goes on and on. And the only way that you can meet any of these requirements is to, quite frankly, either you have to slow down or you have to use some way of kind of helping kind of automate or move that process along and do it consistently. But again, all those things take up space. So if you think about how materials are flowing into the decontamination area, and then you say, okay, now I have a certain sink, and you say, okay, well, I'm going to take a certain amount of time to go through that 3 basin sink. If it's going to slow down or it's going to go too fast, that again impacts quality, but it impacts the amount of people you need. It impacts the space. All those things are changing. Again, at the most basic level, I had a conversation recently about staffing, and you're going to say, well, benchmarking for X amount of ORs, X amount of cases per day equates to a certain amount of staffing you need. Which again, those folks have to work in that space. You have to have the right amount of space and clearances for them. But there is a point where if there is an expectation that it's going to take you 10 minutes to do a tray, not 2 minutes to do a tray, all those things, the queuing space requires is more, or you need to have more sinks, or you need to have more people, you need to have all the equipment to support it. I mean, all that stuff impacts the amount of square footage you need.
I just think flow.
Yeah, it impacts flow for sure.
And along that with flow, you got downstream effect. You've got to talk to facilities within your hospital organization. You got to think about biomed, where they're going, HR, hiring. It's just, it just flows all through. It's like you get the initial build out and the process flow, what it's going to look like. And then how do you feel it accordingly and make sure you check the boxes with all the support services as well. Right, Tom?
Yeah. No, I mean, all those things. I mean, I think there is a point where you have to think about all the customers. So again, you have clinics and you have ORs and how all those different things flow in at any given time, and potentially how you can impact those, from an operational standpoint. But at the end of the day, like you said, there's supplies, there's EVS has to be involved. There's all the different, compartmental, the 3-zone within SPD, and many SPDs are 2 zones. And as you're changing from a 2-zone to a 3-zone, that requires additional square footage. There's pass-through sterilizers that have to be considered. There's implications on space. So as you think about, the fact you're going from a 2-zone SPD to a 3-zone, that in itself changes the way you're doing business, and it changes the way you're going to be sizing the department. It impacts, even the communication within the department, how you can do that. And quite frankly, for people to move around as they need to and still stay within their respective areas.
All right. All this is bringing back these incredible memories I had back when I was an orthopedic rep back in the day. And many times between cases, trying to flip a case, trying to, get a doctor happy, we would go back as a rep and help start cleaning in SPD, and now listen to this conversation, I had no idea what I was doing, but we would do the main stuff. But I guess this leads to my question is the volume in acute care hospitals what it was on surgery, or has a lot of it transferred to the surgery centers? And what does that look like?
Yeah, we are seeing a significant push to the outpatient centers. I think one of the things that's changing too is, this 25 pound per tray requirement. And you might have previously had very heavy trays, bigger trays. Now you might have smaller trays. And that quite frankly can impact the amount of trays you can put through. A sterilizer can impact the storage requirements. It can impact a lot of different things. So there is this decanting that's occurring, again, to align to the right, what I would call surgical area, if you want to call it that, between an ASC and an acute care location. I think the part that comes up more and more often is as you start to decentralize and start pushing stuff further and further out into the community, it's like do you really want to build another SPD in a surgery center? Do you really want to renovate the existing acute care location? And should you start to think about centralization? Because that changes the paradigm to say, I have the same, why keep trays potentially locally to ASC when those could be used in multiple ASCs, and you can start leveraging your assets and moving things around and not necessarily building. Again, it's almost like the same thing. Healthcare is like build it again and build it again and build it again and hope that it just continues to work. And it does. At some point, I would say it's broken. I mean, you can't just keep building things. And if you do, you have to start to take those, again, pharmacies, looking the same way, supply chain in terms of centralization, SPD is, on that pathway. And again, if you think about construction and planning, all the things that go around centralization can be significant. And how do you create those mechanisms to get things in and out of that facility effectively and get back out to the right facility where it needs to go? And that comes to technology and track and trace and knowing where things are at any given time, throughout the entire network, not just within the four walls of the hospital.
A big part of that's the logistics piece. I kind of want to ask you too, though, especially where we're talking a little bit about, the supply chain implications, but also workflow, logistics. Have you seen a change in how involved supply chain becomes in some of these construction renovation projects? Like, was it less maybe 20 years ago and more now? Is it about the same? What's the trending there?
Yeah, I mean, I would say more times than not, supply chain is involved in the capital procurement. And because again, there's significant money, especially if you talk about a brand new hospital or it might be hundreds of millions of dollars worth of equipment that's being purchased. And there's a lot of stuff that could be reused. All those things from a negotiation standpoint, again, supply chain, I would say I'm seeing more and more that they take ownership of it. There's absolutely no reason they should be allowing, another, third party company to come in and do all those things and negotiate on their behalf, because again, they want to make sure they get the best pricing, they can leverage their scale, especially if they have multiple projects going on. What you want to be able to do is like, hey, if I have this ASC project and I have a new hospital build and I have an MOB and I have all these different things, you should be able to try to leverage that scale, all the projects that are going on. I will say that a couple of projects come to mind, and I think those folks are, again, very progressive, and to make sure that the requirements are very clear. I think that's one of the things that we see when somebody is doing on behalf of the health system. They end up getting something that they don't need, something that wasn't going to meet the requirements, and that somebody wasn't sure on what the actual requirement was. So I think defining that and getting the end users involved, getting supply chain to agree to it, again, writing specifications, whatever it is, to make sure that whatever you're buying is not a waste. Because I've seen so much waste along the way where someone's like, yeah, I don't even know where this came from. Who ordered this? And it's like, it's a waste of money. I mean, health systems are already strapped for money to begin with, let alone wasting it.
Agreed on that. Well, is there best practices that you could advise or maybe some place you've seen that did a really good job on the supply chain side, getting in front of the construction project or anything like that?
Yeah, I would say one that comes to mind is probably Ohio State. Again, I would say they have a more progressive process around, contracting, procurement, all those types of things. Because again, they have an 840 bed hospital they're opening up. They have a number of ASCs that are opening up again as we speak. I think they see that, it could be hundreds of millions of dollars that are being spent on equipment. And it's a matter of saying, like, this is our time to shine. I mean, you can only squeeze so much out of a med-surg agreement. At some point, you have to start looking elsewhere, whether it's purchase services or capital equipment. And that's where the real money is. If you think about, there's 350 plus projects north of $100 million going on in the country. And that's just like, I'm sure there's a lot more than that I'm aware of. And there's millions and millions of dollars that are being spent on equipment. And somebody needs to make sure they're buying the right stuff at the end of the day. I mean, it's real money.
It's so different between capital equipment, though, and instrumentation. Because like, how many times do you hear like, okay, these are the surgeons that are really going to, increase our volume. We're going to expand, or we're going to add this service, and you go out and you buy all these instruments that kind of match up with whatever their pick list is for their sets that they use wherever else they're working. You buy all that equipment, and then all of a sudden the surgeon changes their mind. You get a different surgeon, and like, but at least you can pivot in that scenario. You might have lost some dollars, but you can pivot. When it comes to capital equipment, like getting that all in the design and planning phase, like addressed, like, does it make sense for a supply chain to try to start those RFPs before even design and planning begins? Or, how early should they get involved?
Yeah, I would say, call it the planning and design phase from, call it master planning concepts through construction documents, construction administration. It's probably like design development is probably where they start to engage. So it's about halfway through the process is where there's enough definition, whether that's sterilizers or washers or whether there's some need to certain types of technology, then I would say there's enough definition at that point to kind of help move it along. And quite frankly, at that point, there's still years and years until the facility opens. You might say, okay, by design development, you're in the mode of doing some procurement, but the facility might not open for another 4+ years at that point. Could be 5. You know what I mean? So then there's a lot of the piece that I think you have to be mindful of. If you pull the trigger too quick and buy something, same thing on anything with SPD is that it's changing.
Yeah, it's outdated.
It's outdated. And by the time, and you have it sitting there and you feel good about it, you checked it off the list and everybody feels good about themselves, but you have outdated equipment that you don't even want anymore. You're like, oh, what about the new stuff? What about the new thing? What about the new robot? The list goes on and on. So it's a balancing act of doing it too soon, but also kind of keeping the skids greased so people understand that you can't wait to the last minute either.
Yeah, even for just manufacturing a large piece of capital equipment, right? Like, you don't know what their orders are going to look like once you finally place your order either.
Yeah. And right? I think having a conversation about lead time and, availability and I think those, and whether there's, things that can be done. I mean, too often somebody starts, somebody buys it and all of a sudden the service contract starts and it could be a year until it gets installed and you already lost a year of service contract. So there's so many things that are intertwined.
Oh, that's such a great point.
Tom, on the opposite side of that, have you ever seen a situation where supply chain didn't do their job right and it was a catastrophe?
Yeah, I won't name names, but
no names. Call him Tommy from from Tupelo.
Yeah, I would say yes. I think that the most fundamental thing is just communication. I think they're assuming somebody else is doing it. Is what I've noticed. It's like they're like, oh, someone else is taking care of it, not my problem. Nothing I need to worry about. And then they realize like they didn't do their job, and all of a sudden the place opened and they're missing things, or they need to be expediting and they're paying expedited freight and they're paying additional pricing, higher pricing than they should. And so I think some of it just comes back to it's just being involved in the design process more than anything, and just knowing where things are and where should they engage and who's doing what. Because I think there is, to a certain degree, I think, Justin, you brought it up, there a number of years ago was kind of the default was that the contractor was going to buy all the equipment. And I don't think that's a default anymore. I think it's kind of been, I think health systems are starting to see that we have to change. We can't allow, all this stuff to happen. They're buying things that we don't even have agreements on, that we don't agree to. Like there's so many things that are intertwined.
So who does own sort of that communication now? I mean, this might be my last question, but who does own all that communication? If we're talking about getting supply, did you say thank goodness, Hayes?
No, that's what I hope
so. Oh my God, you guys are good friends, I tell you.
Oh yeah. So who should own all this communication then? Because to your point, we're like advocating that supply chain be more involved, have more sort of engagement in the selection of the equipment. That service agreement point was huge, right? Why do you want to pay for a service agreement when you're not even using the equipment for a year? I mean, that's just lost dollars, right? So having a provision in the contract, but supply chain would have to be involved for that to even be kind of on the radar, right? Or contracting and procurement would have to be, function of supply chain. So, but who really has to make sure that everybody's communicated with as you're going through that process? Because I almost feel like sometimes when you bring in more stakeholders, people lose sort of control on, wait a second, who's responsible for communicating what?
Yeah, I think it's important for supply chain. Generally speaking, there is called an equipment planner on every project. They're doing every piece of equipment, whether it's trash cans and chairs and paper clips, whatever. But they're doing a lot of the kind of the main things that are in the facility. And I think making sure there's an alignment of what they actually are buying, what they're not buying, because sometimes what's in their agreement of what they're actually going to be involved in is limited. And other times it might be a lot more, it might be much broader. So I think supply chain has to engage with the facility planning and design team, but they also need to engage very heavily with the equipment planner to make sure they know exactly what they're thinking. Too often we see the equipment planner just kind of saying, hey, this is what you need. No idea what the real requirements are. And then they're potentially buying something that is, not useful, not helpful for the end user.
So big takeaway from this, get close to the equipment planner to make sure that kind of that knowledge, because the equipment planner doesn't have the contracting knowledge, doesn't have the service agreement knowledge, right? There's somebody that's really looking at blueprints and what needs to go where. Is that correct?
Pretty much. Yeah. I mean, I would say they have knowledge of many different things, but I think when you get into some of the, again, to go back to the washers and the sterilizers, I would say that's an area where, again, for us, it's like making sure we're very clear on what they need, how much they need, what's the type of equipment they need. Because again, those specifications have to be defined. And if you just leave it up to somebody to say, hey, I think I need this, or I think I need that. I mean, there's thousands and thousands of things that they have to buy or be involved in to make sure it's in the facility. And for some of these big pieces of equipment, fixed equipment, you can't screw that one up. You really can't. I mean, so you need to have enough oversight and visibility. If you buy the wrong trash can that you don't like, or the whatever it is, again, okay. But other things you need to be a little more actively involved in.
Yeah, you can't repurpose a sterilizer you don't want very easily.
Yeah, or sell it to somebody else. And it's just there's certainly many components to it, but yeah, it's crazy what you see sometimes.
All right, Tom, great job with the interview. Great work trying to help sterile processing departments kind of move forward into the highly technical era that is his healthcare. We see a lot of technology in the operating room, but we haven't always seen a lot of technology in sterile processing. But being purposeful with that selection, and then all of those considerations around capital equipment, and where does supply chain fit into that? I also really like the communication piece and making sure that, everybody's got kind of their say in it, because it's kind of like, you're getting, a whole new department. This is your home. It's almost like you're rebuilding or building your home. If you're working in that department, you want it to be a place that, you want to come home to or go to work to every single day. And so, if somebody starts to feel like they're not getting what they were hoping for, or they can't meet the volumes that are required by surgery, and, all of those kinds of pitfalls, engaging those stakeholders is so critical. I feel like supply chain plays a key role in that.
100%. Yeah.
Anything you'd add, Tom?
Yeah. I mean, the last thing I would add, I mean, I think one of the biggest challenges that we see, and, just trying to make sure we communicate to clients, is just the fact that we have to define what the needs are, not just define what the needs are today, but what the needs are in the future, and how the industry is changing, the requirements are changing. How do we kind of make sure that's accounted for, but also make sure that we're defining and what I would say, calculating, and whether we're determining what the actual needs are versus someone said, I think, I feel, I hope, I pray, I whatever, versus like, because when someone comes back and says, I need you to cut, washers or sterilizers or XYZ out of it, you have to be able to say, well, what's the potential impact to surgery? What's the impact to response time? What's the impact to whatever it is, if it's quality? Because if you don't, then someone's going to say, oh, are you okay with that? And you're like, I'm not sure. I don't think so. Okay, good. So you have 30% less space. We're good to go now. Versus saying, like, these are the things that will impact you, and you can quantify them. And those are things for us we're doing with clients every single day, because if they don't, and they don't have that advocate for them, they will lose 30% of their space, 100%. And they'll be, for the next decade, they'll be struggling every single day. People will be leaving. They will be able to meet the needs of the surgery. There'll be a lot of complaints, and the vicious cycle continues. So I would just say,
which is the whole point of the renovation, is to get away from that, right? That's usually one of the biggest impetus to, hey, we need to renovate. It isn't just about putting in new equipment. It's about solving problems.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, yeah, I think things are changing. We just need to be mindful of, and how do we leverage those, again, new requirements, and make sure the health systems are well aware of the impact it has from space and people and equipment and everything else that goes with it.
Well, workforce shortages is a constant conversation. So when you're trying to create a state-of-the-art department, one of the things you're hoping for is employee retention too. So you want to do it right. And Tom, you gave us a lot of best practices for doing that. If anybody out there is either involved or has an upcoming SPD renovation, they know who to call. Tom, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
That was Tom Redding, Senior Managing Director of Healthcare at St. Ange Company. And actually, what we didn't talk about in the interview is the fact that St. Ange is located right here in my hometown in Pennsylvania. So Tom and I actually live only 20 minutes from each other, but hadn't met until the last couple of months, ironically. Great conversation today around renovations, the impact on logistics, and thinking about workflows and trying to have a vision for the future. That's probably the biggest thing for me, Hayes. It's like, this is a long process, renovation, new build. And a lot of it requires people to try to predict the future, both in, caseloads and volumes, surgical volumes that may be coming down the pike, any increases that they might want to do for that, trying to understand what changes may be coming in technology, and then still kind of communicate that with everybody. And where does supply chain fit? Certainly they're having a much increased role, according to Tom.
Well, I think that was the point that I'm going to take home was supply chain has to be way in the front of this process. They cannot be brought in, 6 months later. They need to be on the front. They also need to be, in charge of on the capital side, negotiating, looking at new technologies, doing all those things. So he brought up some really good examples and a worst case scenario as well. So it was really good. He knows what he's talking about. I learned a lot.
Yeah, I like that service contract tip too, like making sure you're not paying for something before you really need it. And there's got to be a nice simple clause that you can put into your agreements, to be able to cover that. So you're not paying for something that you're not using. Great job today from Tom. And I want to thank everybody out there for listening to this episode of Power Supply on behalf of Hayes, Gary, and myself. Tune in next time to Do It, Hayes.
Power Supply.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Power Supply. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing on your favorite podcast app or by downloading the smartphone app on your iPhone or Android. Simply search for Power Supply in the App Store or Google Play. The best thing about downloading the smartphone app is that you can access bonus content for certain episodes and view episodes in certain categories, like articles on the go and vendor spotlights. Are you following us on LinkedIn or Facebook yet? If you are and you love an episode or post, then let your social network know about it. Like, comment, or share our posts along with your thoughts and keep the conversation going. If you have any topics or guests that you would like to recommend for a future episode, just send us an email to info@powersupplymedia.net. We look forward to hearing from you.